All right. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Welcome to Sacred Sanctuaries, Resilience in God's Marine Creation. My name is Avery Davis Lamb, and I'm a co-executive director of Creation Justice Ministries. The mission of Creation Justice Ministries is to educate, equip, and mobilize Christians and Christian institutions to protect, restore, and rightly share God's creation. Today's program is part of our Climate Resilience Workshop series, in which we're asking the question, how can our churches be hubs of resilience in our communities, helping our neighbors weather the physical, the spiritual, and the social storms of the climate crisis? You can watch all of our previous webinars on our YouTube page, which is at youtube.com/creationjusticeministries. We also invite you to subscribe if you're on YouTube so you can follow along with any videos we share in future webinars. But for tonight's program, we encounter a word that is so familiar to those of us who are from faith-based communities, and that word is sanctuaries. We know that sanctuaries are sacred places where we experience the love of God and where we experience our community. They're places that deserve our love and respect. And our National Marine Sanctuaries are beloved places for our country. They offer spaces for us to marvel at the wonder and the beauty of God's creation and the ecosystems that build resilience in a climate-changed world. Unfortunately, we're not always treating our marine sanctuaries the way they deserve to be treated, as sacred. So today we have three excellent guests who are taking up this conversation around sacred sanctuaries. Hermina Glass-Hill will open us up in prayer and reflection. Dr. Kirsten Grorud-Colvert will share her ecological expertise about sanctuaries and other marine protected areas. And Helen Smith will invite us into the spiritual practice of advocacy and action. Now, before we hand it over to the speakers, just a few housekeeping things to note. The first thing is, if you haven't already, please do introduce yourself in the chat. And when you do so, be sure to select everyone so that your introduction goes out, not just to the hosts and panelists, but to everyone on the call. We'll also have a short Q&A session at the end of the program. So as questions or thoughts come up for you, you can submit those questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. I ask that you please put your questions in the Q&A function and not in the chat function, because we might lose them if they get in the chat function, just in case the chat gets a little rowdy and exciting. So if you put them in the Q&A, we'll be sure to find those and to share them with our presenters. And then finally, as you can see, this workshop is being recorded, and we will send it out to everyone who registered, as well as those of you who are joining us. That'll be sent out via email next week. It'll be available over YouTube, and you can share that with your communities. At this point, I am excited to introduce a friend and a colleague, Hermina Glass-Hill. Hermina is an oral historian, a grassroots community organizer, an earth justice activist, and an ocean conservationist. She engages this work with deep faith and active hope in bringing humanity into harmony with our natural blue and green world. She believes in the cultural values of biodiversity as a portal for communities to access ocean and climate justice. Hermina is the administrator of the MK Pentecost Ecology Trust Fund at the Savannah Presbytery, which is part of the PCUSA, which awards grants to coastal nonprofit organizations in Georgia and South Carolina that seek to protect wild and marine life. She's also the founder of the Coastal Black Women's Ocean Conservation Collective, a program that amplifies the cultural heritage of diaspora Black women and their sacred coastal communities. She's employed by a large ocean conservation NGO with offices in 30 countries. And most recently, Hermina was appointed as an advisory council member at Grays Reef National Marine Sanctuary. She is the co-founder of the Susie King Taylor Women's Institute and Ecology Center, and she serves as a board member of the Sankofa Society. Currently, she is in the process of authoring a chapter on climate change in IFA, using an African paradigm in contemporary culture. And with that, Hermina, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Avery, for that introduction. If you will join me now in a word of prayer. O Creator God, the creator of life-giving spirit. Wherever there is life, it is sacred. Whether it is the heavens beyond, the sky above, the land or the oceans, life is sacred. The psalmist said, "There is the sea, vast and spacious, teeming with life of every kind, both large and small. There the ships go and to and fro, and the Leviathan, which you formed to frolic there. All creatures look to you, God, to give them their life at the proper time." Job said, "Speak to the earth, and it will teach you, and let the fish in the sea inform you and declare to you. O God, you have created this marine life that it may give life to all, that it may bless all, that, as the scripture has said, it is teeming with all sorts of biodiversity that you have created, all with a purpose, all sacred, and within that sanctuary. We thank you. We bless your holy name. Amen. In my line of work, I am interested in protecting marine biodiversity. There are two marine animals that are really, really dear to my heart. And that's because here on the Georgia coast, there is the loggerhead sea turtles, and every winter, the North Atlantic right whales migrate from Canada to the southeast off the coast of Georgia and Florida. And they travel thousands of miles to get here. My heart cries out because the North Atlantic right whales are currently threatened by human causes, and they are endangered to the point that they are less than 330 in existence, and even less than 100 females, which to that extent really speaks volumes as to the longevity of this marine mammal on planet Earth. They are threatened by entanglement from fishing lines, and they are threatened by ships, boats, recreational boats, commercial fishing ships that are just simply going too fast. This call for action today really warms my heart because it is another opportunity for a very important sector of our society, the faith community, to step in and amplify the message of how our marine sanctuaries are sacred sanctuaries, and they are in need of added protections. I thank you all for the action that you will take today in protecting sacred sanctuaries. Thank you.
Thank you, Marina. Thank you for your prayer and reflection, and thank you for your witness day in and day out of justice for these creatures and for these marine sanctuaries. I'd like to now introduce our second panelist for this evening, Dr. Kirsten Grorud-Colvert. Dr. Grorud-Colvert is a marine ecologist and associate research professor in the integrative biology department at Oregon State University. She completed her PhD at the University of Miami in 2006, and she's broadly interested in marine ecology and the connections between healthy ocean ecosystems and the people who depend on them. Her expertise is in marine biodiversity, ocean management, social ecological systems, conservation biology, marine protected areas, the biology and ecology of commercially fished species, and the early life history of fishes. Her current research focus is on ecological and social processes related to marine protected areas and other area-based management tools worldwide, with a focus on national and international policies related to ocean protection. Thankfully, we'll get to hear a lot about all of that tonight. Dr. Grorud-Colvert also co-leads the MPA Guide and directs the Science of Marine Reserves project, which shares science about MPAs in collaboration with partners worldwide to help find solutions to the challenges facing our oceans. She sits on the leadership team of the National Ocean Protection Coalition, participates in the Race and the Ocean Community for Listening, Learning, and Action, and co-leads the Tales from the Sea project to compile scientist stories about our changing ocean. With that, I invite Dr. Kirsten Grorud-Colvert.
Thank you, Avery. Thank you so much to you all for being here. It is a privilege and a blessing to be in this space. I'm going to share some slides today for many reasons. Among them, the ocean brings us some beautiful spaces. And so today, when I talk about protecting our sacred sanctuaries, I invite you all to take in these images and really celebrate that God's creation is so vast, so crazy in terms of what it entails, especially underwater, and the responsibility that we have as Christians and people of faith to help protect it. So as a scientist, I don't often get to speak in places of faith. And so I'm grateful for this opportunity. I came to faith at a young age. And for me, in my lifetime, the intersection of science and faith has been a driving force in my life. I grew up in Tucson, Arizona. Speaking about God's crazy creation has some of the most incredible life forms on our planet. But also, I think from growing up in the desert, I developed such a value and appreciation for water. Thinking about all the ways that water is spoken about and represented in the Bible, you know, this sacred life-giving force. It was a nice point of intersection for me. And so that deep love from childhood on drove me to our largest body of water, which is, of course, the ocean. So during my scientific career, I've spent a lot of time underwater. One of the first places that I was so fortunate to be able to spend those hours was in the Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary off the coast of California. These were really formative years in my life as an undergraduate researcher. And from there, I springboarded to the Florida Keys and was blessed to be able to conduct research in another National Marine Sanctuary here along the incredible coral reefs of that coast. During my time underwater, I saw incredible spaces, habitats, species, but I also saw a lot of change. And that change impacted me very deeply. As you all may have had your own experiences in nature, there's nothing like feeling so connected to a space and the species, like, for example, one of my favorite elkhorn corals on the left. And then to see those sites change, to see those individual species, like this coral, start to decline. In the case of this particular branching coral, I saw during my time there, it basically crumble after it had been wrapped in fishing line. So those were really profound things that I saw. But I also saw that some sites were changing more than others. And here I'm sharing the fact that one of these sites was a marine protected area and one site was not. And these MPAs are incredible tools that I want to talk to you more about today. Because when we talk about sacred spaces, our sanctuaries, we're really talking about MPAs. Now, the changes that I saw there in the Florida Keys are unfortunately not unusual, and they're not unique. Ocean systems are threatened and changing around the world. We know that the ocean absorbs a quarter of the carbon dioxide emissions from humans. And because of that, the chemistry of the ocean is changing, which is truly mind-boggling to think that the impacts of our species have had repercussions for an entire body of water like the ocean. We also know that between 1950 and about 2011, through fishing, we depleted 90% of the biomass of fish worldwide. And we don't actually even know how that's continuing to impact because so many fisheries are understudied and data poor. So what we estimate conservatively is that we're probably decimating these fisheries 3 times faster than we originally thought. Oil and gas and mining is continuing to be a pressure on the ocean floor. And of course, anytime you're digging things up, anytime you're mowing through with bottom trawling, you're drastically impacting these habitats, some of which have been alive for a very long time. So we know the ocean is changing, but we also know that marine protected areas are one of the best solutions. And I want to talk to you about them today as a scientist and a person of faith, because we, by God's grace, have a lot of information that we can bring to bear to do a better job of protecting these ocean spaces, but also the human communities that rely on these spaces. They are not separate, they are intertwined. Now, not all MPAs are the same. They allow different activities. By definition, marine protected areas are places in the ocean that are set aside for the conservation of biodiversity. And as people of faith, we could say the conservation of God's creation underwater. So they are very unique in that that is their role. But within that term, marine protected areas, there's a lot of variability. And because of that, we have to be really clear about what MPAs are doing and where. The reality is that different MPAs, when they have different activities happening inside, will likely have very different outcomes for people and for nature. Now, given that's the case, how do we test this? This is actually not an insignificant issue and a real challenge when we're looking at protecting the ocean effectively. So to test this, we underwent an inclusive, collaborative, and consultative process to evaluate the state of the science and the state of local knowledge about the different types of MPAs. We wanted to bring everything to bear to better understand what types of areas we were protecting and how well we were protecting them. Now, the good news is we know a lot about MPAs. In fact, MPAs in their various forms have been used traditionally by Indigenous peoples for generations. We also have a great amount of scientific research to bring to bear from literally hundreds of studies around the world in hundreds of marine protected areas around the world. So we took all that information across a range of different species. I mean, just incredible to think about studying this incredible diversity across habitats as well, and then also across the human communities that rely on them and that enjoy them, get their livelihood and their culture from them. So bringing all this information to bear, we devised something called the MPA Guide, and I want to share it with you today because it's an important tool for being able to peel back the layers of what's happening in our sanctuaries and our other marine protected areas in this country and around the world. What we found is that there's really 4 key aspects to consider when we're determining whether a marine protected area is going to be effective at conservation. The first is we have to understand the stage of establishment. We have to understand the level of protection that's occurring inside the area. We have to understand the enabling conditions, all the ingredients for an MPA to be successful. And all of these come together to determine whether or not we're going to achieve the social and ecological outcomes that we want. So what do I mean by that? Let me elaborate, but first also point to all the different founding partners that are behind this tool, the MPA Guide, including the United Nations, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, National Geographic, our group, and the Marine Protection Atlas, which is at the Marine Conservation Institute. So what do we mean by stage of establishment? Globally, there are some areas that are just proposed or committed, and these are areas where the intention to create an MPA is put forward, but nothing is yet active in the water. There's also MPAs that are designated. That means that they are legally defined. They're recognized through legal or other traditional means. They're official, shall we say. But importantly, they're not yet active on the water. And sites that are active in the water then step into this next stage, which is implemented. Now, it's incredibly important to know this. And actually, the way we tally MPAs worldwide right now, we're not tracking this level of information. And so you can imagine it's really important when you're trying to evaluate whether or not an MPA is being effective if it's not even active in the water. And then finally, actively managed is the stage where resources and capacity are brought to bear to ensure that the sites are active and effective over the long term with monitoring and community engagement, evaluation of the management, ongoing investment and success. So these are the stages of establishment. The level of protection is also vital because this is where we start to consider the fact that different MPAs have different activities happening within them, and these are allowed activities. So minimally protected is the lowest level of protection, and in these MPAs, there are extensive extraction and other impacts, and they're occurring because they're allowed. Now, by definition, an MPA still has to provide some conservation benefit, but we would expect that benefit to be very small. Lightly protected is where some protection exists, but there's still a range of different activities that are allowed, although with moderate impact. As we move into highly and fully protected, these are the sites where we're starting to see only light or no extractive activities allowed, other impacts minimized. And these are the areas where we would really expect the best conservation outcomes to happen. Highly protected areas, I love to talk about because we think of these as areas where local communities, indigenous communities have been stewarding them for generations, living in balance with these resources, in deep respect for them. And so in highly protected areas, even if there's some light forms of extraction, these we wouldn't expect would significantly decrease conservation. Fully and highly really fill an important role. Now, enabling conditions, I want to make sure to talk about because as we think about communities impacted by or benefited by these marine protected areas, these are the who and the how of MPAs. Important to consider this partnership and co-management with local communities and rights holders and stakeholders, inclusive, equitable, and evidence-based decision-making, long-term support, collaboration, transparency, communication. I would add empathy, accountability. These are all the things that we as ecological scientists don't often talk about, but through my collaborations and friendships and learning from my social science colleagues, you know, these also need to be tracked just as carefully as lines on a map. So if enabling conditions are in place, here's where we get to the punchline. Fully and highly protected MPAs are incredibly important for the benefits that they can provide. They protect biodiversity. Yes, they can also enhance fisheries in areas nearby. They protect ecological balance. When we think about resilience, that's it, ecological balance. It can buffer against mistakes in management or this uncertainty we have with a changing climate. We don't actually know what's next. MPAs are an insurance policy against that. They provide reference areas so we can understand the impact of different activities, and they protect culturally important species and activities. Carbon stores, what we call blue carbon, can be protected by marine protected areas because no dredging or dumping or bottom trawling would occur there. And they can also enhance climate resilience. So this is a laundry list of benefits, but we need sites to be fully and highly in order to achieve them. I want to show you some pictures of this from Cabo Pulmo, which is in Mexico. This is a place where the local community was severely impacted by the overexploitation of their resources, including poaching and illegal fishing from outside their community. In 1999, they came together and decided to set apart a portion of their fishing grounds and fully protect it in an MPA. So this is what it looked like before it was designated. And then after implementation, 10 years later, this is what that exact same piece of old degraded coral looks like. So you can imagine what this means in terms of larger sizes of fishes and other organisms, greater biodiversity, also greater economic outcomes for the community, because all these fish inside the boundaries of the MPA tend to move outside when they get too crowded. And so the fishing grounds surrounding have also started to increase in the size and the catches of the fish. So it's an incredible success story and not unusual when we look at the data from around the globe. Now, I wanted to share this graphic because I think it's so impactful to think about how things have changed over time in the past. We were limited in how much we could extract from the ocean, and areas where sanctuaries just existed because we couldn't get to them. In the present, we have a very different scenario. A study about 5 years ago showed that there's literally no place in the ocean that is unaffected by human impacts. That being the case, what our future ocean looks like depends on what we decide in terms of level of protection for establishing MPAs. These fully and highly protected areas, we see what those benefits can be. But lightly and minimally protected areas are not going to get us those same benefits. And this becomes increasingly important when we start to peel back the layers of what's happening in individual MPAs. So I want to share how we've been using the MPA guide in practice, including in some of our national marine sanctuaries. Now, of course, after we devised this tool, the first thing I wanted to know is these beloved sites where I grew up in so many ways and worshiped in so many ways, what's happening inside them. So turning to the Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary, the stage of establishment is actively managed. This sanctuary has an incredible team of people behind it, stakeholders, rights holders, others who have been actively working to manage this site for decades at this point. It's actively managed in terms of monitoring, periodic reviews of the protection, and plans for adapting its management. Now, when we look at the level of protection, so we're thinking about the different activities that happen inside the Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary, it's only lightly protected. And that's because there is a number of moderate but impactful activities that are happening there, namely fishing with nets and traps and lines, sport fishing by scuba. There are also some areas where anchoring is unregulated and could be threatening sensitive habitats. So this sanctuary does have these types of impactful activities happening within it. Now, I want to be clear that there are some areas within that are fully protected, but they are very small, and the majority of it is lightly protected, which is why we scored it in that way. Let's check the Florida Keys. So the stage of establishment here is also actively managed. The National Marine Sanctuary System is an incredible resource in that it is a focal point for marine conservation in our country and receives resources, albeit limited and never enough, but to manage these sites. So again, the Florida Keys Sanctuary is actively managed. But when we look at its level of protection, it's minimally protected. I showed you some pictures at the beginning from an MPA and a non-MPA site. Those are, again, very small sites, sanctuary preservation areas within the larger sanctuary, but the vast majority is minimally protected because it includes a large number of gear types that have varying levels, some of them high impact, including long lining, beach seining, more spear fishing, traps, nets, lines, and including gleaning as well. So in fact, there are a lot of extractive activities happening inside this marine sanctuary. And the reality is lower levels of protection will compromise these sanctuaries' ability to provide benefits, including resilience, resilience to human impacts, including climate change. Now, meanwhile, the Biden administration has set big goals for our country. In the America the Beautiful report and executive order, President Biden has charged us with protecting 30% of the US ocean by 2030. So that's a big goal. And as scientists, we were really interested in evaluating what do we have so far in terms of ocean protection in the States, and what do we still need? So we undertook a study to find out just that. And we looked at the 50 largest US MPAs. There are more than 200 of them, but the vast majority of them are very small. Together, these 50 largest encompass 99.9% of the total area of the US ocean in MPAs. These included 9 of the 15 National Marine Sanctuaries, including the Channel Islands and Florida Keys. And we evaluated each of these MPAs for stage of establishment and level of protection. We tallied all the numbers, and that helped us understand how much of the US ocean is protected and at different levels. So what did we find out? We found out actually that 26% of US waters are in an MPA. So that's a high number. It's very close to 30%. The vast majority of that area by percent is highly or fully protected, and most are actively managed. That's a great story. But we also found that only 1.9% of the waters around the continental US are protected in any kind of MPA. And the vast majority of that is lightly or minimally protected. So when you think about the incredible diversity of habitats and species in these areas, kelp forests, rocky reefs, some of these coral reefs, they are vulnerable. They're vulnerable to different types of extractive activities. They're not MPAs at all for the most part, and the small percentage that is only very minimally protected. We also found that almost all MPA area, including that highly or fully protected big percent, is in the Central Pacific. So when we think about that incredible win in that area, but also the disproportionate responsibility of those Central Pacific communities in stewarding those and in setting aside parts of their waters. The level of protection varies significantly by region in the US. Outside of the Central Pacific, no other region is even close to a 30% target. So I want to show you this in an image that's quite striking. Each of these circles represents the total area, either marine area, which you see in that darker blue color. So the Pacific has the greatest marine area, Alaska the next, and so on. The turquoise circle shows how much of that area is in MPAs. And you see the exact percentage in that gold color at the bottom. So the Pacific has about 52, almost 53% of its marine area protected at MPAs. That's very significant. But Alaska, on the other hand, has only about 0.7% protected in MPAs, and so on down the line to the northwest. When we look by level of protection at the bottom, you can see we're talking about fully, highly, lightly, minimally, as we outline in the MPA guide. And when you look at the Pacific, you see a lot of those cool colors because, again, there's a high proportion that's fully or highly protected. As you move into the continental areas of the US, you're seeing a lot of green and gold, and that's because those areas are only lightly or minimally protected. When we look at this protection in terms of where it's located on a map, we're noticing that US ocean protection is vastly different in distant versus continental waters. So looking at these warmer colors, gold to green, these are MPA coverage that's only less than 1%, or 3, or in the green, even 5%. Any percent that's larger than 10% is that purple color that you see. And so we see that that Pacific region, again, is well protected, but the other areas of the continental US are incredibly vulnerable. And by extension, the communities that rely on this resilience and the resources that these areas provide. So what do we still need? I don't intend you to read everything on this slide. Perhaps take a screenshot if you have the means. But essentially, we as a country have invested a lot, but we need to establish more, particularly because our continental waters are underprotected. We need to consider highly and fully protected areas, consider them to be durable, so they'll continue to work into the future. And we need to improve our attention and commitment to equity in new and existing MPAs, not only in terms of spatial coverage, but also in co-management and the other enabling conditions that ensure an MPA can be successful. So what does this mean for protecting our sacred sanctuaries? We really need to understand that the activities that are happening in sanctuaries right now have impact. This is a surprising fact, I think, to most people, and truly it was surprising to us as well. We think of these sanctuaries as sacred spaces set aside, but in fact, there's a lot of activities that are destructive that are happening there. It requires a careful look at whether or not our sanctuaries are able to achieve biodiversity conservation and resilience because of this. This is God's creation underwater, and if we want it to continue to function, we need to carefully consider what's next for the sanctuaries. And of course, that requires support. As we mentioned, the sanctuaries are actively managed with a huge team of people that are incredibly invested in their success. There are a lot of trade-offs when you set aside an area for protection. And so we as constituents need to continue to support the sanctuaries, not only of their active management, but also their capacity to adapt and increase the level of protection that's needed. And then finally, it requires collaboration, but also, I think, our collective voices to the Biden administration to ensure that the 30% protection of US ocean is effective. It needs to be more than just in one place. It needs to consider level of protection, and we need accountability and science-based support for what's happening within that 30%. So I thank you for your attention and for the space. I thank God for these incredible resources and beautiful spaces. And I pray that this is a helpful set of information as you move forward in your work and in your stewardship. Thank you.
Amen. And thank you so much, Dr. Grode Colfort. That was beautiful and compelling, and just so important to see those images of these amazing spaces and understand how we can better protect them and love them. In that vein, I want to hand it over now to Helen Smith, who is the Ocean Climate Action Associate here at Creation Justice Ministries. And Helen is going to guide us in, as I said earlier, the spiritual practice of advocacy and action, and share with us some actions that we can take to together help put the sacred back in our sanctuaries. So Helen, it's all yours.
Thanks, Avery. And I'm going to go ahead and share a couple slides as well. So one of the reasons we're talking about this month is that, as Kirsten so eloquently stated, we've got this incredible chance to do better. And we are so excited because the National Marine Sanctuaries Act turns 50 years old on October 23rd. That's 2 Sundays from now, I believe. And that means we have the chance to push this current administration to make a big statement. As Kirsten so aptly named and showed us, our problem is that our sanctuaries are not being treated as sacred. We are watching them go downhill. We are seeing that when management reports are written, the conditions are fair to poor. I don't know about you, but I don't think I treat the things I hold as sacred as poorly. I care about the things I find sacred, and I take precaution and I give it priority, and we need to do the same with our marine sanctuaries. And so we have this wonderful privilege and responsibility from God to say, we as the faith community know that these are sacred places and they are not being treated as such. Many of these sanctuaries are under the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, and they do not have the ability to fix this problem alone. They need more resources, they need more authority, and that can be afforded to them from either Congress or the president. Given that Congress means a law has to be passed through the House and the Senate, and that's not strategically the best option right now, going to the president for executive action is. And so we are asking President Biden to use his executive order powers and to do so on the 50th anniversary, October 23rd, which is a Sunday, so it would come out the 24th, essentially press-wise, and to award that authority and the resources needed to NOAA to impact our marine protected areas and our national marine sanctuaries. We also have a prayer that you can pray on the 23rd that will bring you and center you into these great sanctuaries, whether you're near the coast or not. We have an interfaith sign-on, so if you are a faith leader or you have a faith leader that you are thinking of, we would love to have them sign on. That's not just for Christian faith leaders, but faith leaders of all religions and practices. We will drop our social toolkit, which will allow you to amplify this message with sample tweets, Facebook posts, graphics. The prayer is included in that, and a local LTE. You can edit this letter to the editor and submit it to your local paper. You can engage your community members with this. Just letting people know and speaking about it publicly will make a huge, huge difference. And that's where this is going to change. So we're so excited to be able to come upon this anniversary with such hope and optimism. And we are just excited about the ways in which we can make an impact. And each of us has the ability to make a difference and to respond to the call from God to care for this incredible, incredible creation. Because what else is there? So I'm going to turn it back over to Avery, and I think we're going to go into questions.
Great. Thanks so much, Helen. Thanks for leading us in that action. And I'll pause a moment and just give folks an opportunity to open up that toolkit document and the faith leader sign on. Both of those are in the chat. Please open those up and think of, if you're a faith leader, please, I invite you to just sign that now if you're comfortable. Or if you're not a faith leader, to take a moment and think of who are the faith leaders in your community and in your congregation who you can share that with. Also, if you've not yet submitted any questions that you're mulling over, please, I invite you now to submit those, because we're going to transition now into a time of Q&A. So I invite Dr. Grory Colvert to come on video, and I'll share out some of these questions here, which have come up. Some really good ones coming on here. So the first one, Kirsten, is from Angie Gage, and Angie asks, how do MPAs impact fishing of all kinds? In particular, Angie notes that the native have relied upon waters for sustainability, and they're thinking of the native populations, especially in Alaska and Hawaii, and Native Americans who live along the coastlines. They write that these communities understand the sacredness of life that exists within the waters of creation, and They say that, in fact, within my native community, we know that we are to give thanks to God for the spirit of the animals, trees, and the water that lives and provides for the things needed for our lives to be sustained. So just a great question. How are Indigenous communities either allowed to fish in MPAs, or how are they not allowed to fish in MPAs?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Angie, and also just for the witness to the leadership of Indigenous peoples in this space, and the wisdom that we all can gain from them. So I think I would answer in two ways. The first way is to think about stewardship when we evaluate what's happening in MPAs and the impact of activities. I can't, as a scientist, think of better evidence that certain practices are sustainable than that they've been stewarded by Native peoples for generations, and they continued to sustain those communities until only very recently, when other take illegal and legal, but likely should not be, is changing the resources that these communities have relied on for so long. So when we think about the level of protection, these are the areas that we would call highly protected, because they're, the uses that are happening there are not appreciably different from the conserved spaces that you see inside fully protected areas. So these are the highly protected areas. Secondly, I would say that another opportunity to learn from the leadership of Indigenous communities is taking place in the National Marine Sanctuary system right now. There are two proposals that have been put forward by Native communities. One is the Chumash Heritage National Marine Sanctuary proposal, which is in Central California, led by the tribe. And the intention is to protect culturally important species and practices within the area. That has not yet been designated. It is going through the sanctuary process. And so I would encourage us all to support that community with our prayers and our resources, if we can bring them, to support that process, because there is often a lot of pushback against these National Marine Sanctuaries proposals from various other stakeholder groups. Another very new one, and I will put it into the chat because I want to make sure to represent the name in its original language, called the Heart of the Ocean proposal, is coming from the Inuit communities of Alaska. Very newly enrolled proposal for National Marine Sanctuary that similarly is led by the community and their wisdom around their resources. Finally, Papahanaumokuakea is a marine national monument, which I saw another question, we may get to this. There are various ways of establishing MPAs. Marine national monuments are another way that our country at the federal level sets aside in a marine protected area. And Papahanaumokuakea has been co-led and co-managed by the Native Hawaiian communities there. There is a committee of elders that co-determines the management structure of that area. And we call that site highly protected because it does allow Indigenous take, but at such small levels and in keeping with this generations long stewardship.
Thank you, Kirsten. And let's move on to Peter's question, because I think this is really important. And so Peter asks, are marine reserves as opposed to marine sanctuaries created and protected by states as opposed to the federal government? Specifically, and Peter is from Oregon, so he's saying, are Oregon's marine reserves adequately protective? Are there smaller areas such as seabird nesting sites protected under other laws? Saying it seems complicated, which it definitely is. So yeah, could you just share a little bit about the difference between the different kinds of MPAs and maybe and examples of a few of them?
Yeah, great. Thank you, Peter. That's true. When we look at kind of the regulatory structure behind MPAs, there are a number of different ways to create protected areas in the ocean. We've been talking about sanctuaries, which are at the federal level, but certainly there are MPAs that are established by states in their territorial waters, which is from the coastline out to 3 nautical miles. What I would say about that is, in fact, there are some even overlapping with the National Marine Sanctuaries. So for example, in the Channel Islands, there are some state marine reserves that are very highly, in fact, fully protected that are part of that. And so when we use the term marine reserves, oftentimes that's kind of the state's vocabulary about what they're calling their MPA. There's many different names for MPAs around the globe. But in terms of Oregon, our marine reserves, as they're named, are in fact fully protected. They are areas where no extractive or destructive activities are allowed. So good call out to that. They were established, and each state kind of has their own process for establishing MPAs. Oregon's MPAs had a unique approach in that communities could propose an area for an MPA. So for example, in the Oregon community of Port Orford, that fishing community got together, decided which portion of their fishing grounds they wanted to set aside, and proposed a fully protected area that was there offshore in Port Orford. So there are some incredibly empowering ways to establish MPAs. There's also, of course, a suite of resources that each needs, federal versus state support for managing and adaptively managing MPAs can range, but there are various ways to establish them and various names to call them. One of the reasons why we developed the MPA guide so that we can look across all these different kinds and figure out what's happening within them.
Great, thank you. And then this question just came in from William Jones, and William asks, from my understanding, trawling is the most destructive fishing method. Is there an effort to ban trawling? Is there a fishing method that can replace trawling that is less destructive and still allows fishermen to be in business? And then additionally, is there no MPA in the Gulf of Mexico or in Alaska? And then also asks about the Chesapeake Bay.
Thanks, William. Lots of good questions. So trawling first. So trawling is, in fact, yes, incredibly destructive. Not only in terms of the sensitive habitats and species, but trawling produces about 50% of the bycatch worldwide. And bycatch is basically things you didn't intend to take, right? So in that sense, bottom trawling is not only bad for habitats and species, but truly also in many cases also for fishermen, because it is a very blunt force way of fishing. In that respect, there are many kind of gear adaptations that different fisheries use to try and reduce bycatch and to reduce impact to the floor of the ocean. Some of them kind of ride a little bit over the bottom. But the bottom line, no pun intended, is that bottom trawling is in fact a very destructive way of fishing. In the US, we have portions of our waters that are banned to bottom trawling. So it's a bottom trawling ban. Some have lobbied to call those marine protected areas, but I bring it up because it's a very important distinction that these sites are not permanent. At any time, the fisheries management councils can revoke them. So although bottom trawling closures do exist, they are not MPAs because they're not permanent. And because over time, their primary goal is to set aside areas so that they can then be fished later. So that's about bottom trawling. In terms of MPAs in the Gulf of Mexico or Alaska, yes, but they're small. So they weren't in our 50 largest assessment. There are some, they cover a very, very small portion. And again, very few of them are fully or highly protected. The Chesapeake Bay, someone else had asked a question about where do we call it, right? What's a marine protected area? What about moving up the watershed? So estuarine reserves are also part of our federal system. The Chesapeake Bay does have some protections. As we move into estuaries, the kind of uses are very different. And so in our analysis, we didn't dive into the estuary levels of protection and so on. They are not in our national inventory of marine protected areas. They actually end up being slotted on the terrestrial side. But it's a good question for those of us who live along watersheds to educate ourselves about the types of protections that are happening there.
Great. Thank you. Let's see. And there's one more question that just came in through the chat, and Dr. Colbert, I'll invite you to take a look at that and respond in the chat if you're able to, because we do need to turn towards our closing now, getting towards the end. So just gratitude to Hermina for your opening prayer and for your reflection. Gratitude to you, Dr. Grover Colbert, for all of your work and for sharing that wisdom and expertise with us here. Gratitude to Helen for leading us into action. And I ask all of you to join me as we close here with this prayer. This is the prayer that you'll find in that toolkit that Helen shared, and this is the prayer that we invite you all to share with your communities and your churches on October 23rd, so that we can pray this together on the anniversary of the National Marine Sanctuaries Act. So please, in closing, I invite you to pray this with me. Today, leading up to the anniversary of the National Marine Sanctuaries Act, we pray for all the ocean creatures beloved by their creator. We pray for the sand lance in Stellwagen Bank, the stony corals in Florida Keys, the sea otters of Monterey Bay, and the host of other plants and animals across the sanctuaries. We pray for our neighbors who rely on the ocean's provision, particularly indigenous communities who have lived in reciprocity with the ocean for centuries. We recognize that often our marine sanctuaries are not protected in a way that cares for their creatures or glorifies God. We pray that our leaders would have the wisdom and vision to treat these sanctuaries in the way we treat our churches as sacred. Amen. Thanks so much for being with us here, everyone.